All right, so on example 4 here, we are looking at a real-world situation using quadratics where we will have to zero out the quadratic to be able to solve, and we'll be factoring where a is greater than 1. But this situation is going to require us to evaluate our two options that we get as our answer and decide which one is going to make sense. So let's go ahead and get started. So my lovely little drawing here, right? So we have a quadratic equation given to us here. We can call it our function since we're looking at the height will be our y value, t or is our x, which is our time. So we have our fabulous little golfer here. Okay, he's on the second floor. It's 32 feet off the ground, and we have our quadratic equation explaining or going to help us find the height of the ball, and when we'll be deciding when does the ball hit the ground. So we'll be looking for time. Keep that in mind when we get to those answers of positives or negatives. Okay, so let's go ahead and factor this. My a times c plus b. So I get, let me get my calculator here, negative 16. Well, you know what? Before I get started, let's see if we can make these numbers a little bit easier, see if we can factor out a greatest common factor. And so we're going to ask ourselves, does 16 go into 16 and into 32? It's not a method that works every time, but it does help in reducing fractions and looking for GCFs is, does the smaller number make all the other numbers? And in this case, 16 does. So I'm going to, let me go ahead and zero this, and I'm going to factor out a negative 16. I just like to go ahead and get rid of that negative here, and I get a positive t minus 2. Well, that's going to make it a lot easier, right? So I'm not dealing with those larger numbers. So I get a, b, c. So a is 1, b is negative 1, c is negative 2. Making sure I'm taking the signs in front. And a times c is 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. And when I combine those, I should get a negative 1. So my factors of 2 are 1 and 2. Now, for one of those to be a negative, or for my answer to be a negative, one of them has to be a negative and one's a positive. I always do my multiplication rule first. That kind of helps weed out my adding ones. So I know one needs to be positive, one needs to be negative to give me a negative when I add. So I need negatives left over, which means my bigger number needs to be the negative. So 1 minus 2 is negative 1. Okay. Now that my 16's factored out, my negative 16, I'm left with t plus 1 and t minus 2. Okay, when I zero those, negative 16 equals 0, t plus 1 equals 0, and t minus 2 equals 0. Now we know negative 16 is not equal to 0, so I'm done with that. I don't need that. When I move that over, subtract 1 from both sides, I get negative 1. Add 2 to both sides, I get positive 2. So my options are, my time is going to be at negative 1 or at positive 2. This is what's going to zero my function and make my y equal 0. And to know that, if I plugged in my negative 1 for t, these would cancel. Or my 2. All right, so we're talking about time. The time it's going to take this ball to hit the ground. Well, does it make sense to be negative 1 or positive 2? And we know that time, distance is absolute value, that those things cannot be negative. So therefore, where our time is equal to 2 would be the appropriate answer here because it makes sense. And since this is a word problem, essentially, I would write it out. This means that after 2 seconds, the golf ball would hit the ground and put that back in word form.